Financial panic of 1907 further strained relations between Teddy Roosevelt reformers and old guard conservative Republicans. When several New York banks failed in a speculative effort to corner the copper market, they triggered a run on banks, and a short but severe dip in industrial production and widespread layoffs resulted. People everywhere worried that a big depression like that of the 1890s was impending. Only the timely decision of J.P. Morgan and other bankers' willingness to pour huge amounts of cash into banks saved the nation from financial collapse. Morgan was by far the most powerful banker in the country. He also had a massive collection of art and rare books and manuscripts, and so he built a mansion next to his mansion to house all that. Today it's called the Morgan Library. It's an incredible place to visit. And it's in this library, which you see the room right there, that he locked all these other bankers, ordering them to spend all night, if necessary, coming up with a bailout plan, while he sat across the hall in his office playing solitaire. And they did, and he saved the day. Prosperity returned quickly, although jitters remained. Conservatives blamed TR's quote-unquote radical economic policies, but to TR and his fellow reformers, the panic proved the need for a vastly greater amount of reform. Teddy Roosevelt therefore committed himself to an even stronger program of reform, including an overhaul of the banking system. Conservatives were determined to be rid of him. Fearful he might not get the nomination, and mindful of a rash promise he had made in 1904 not to seek a term in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt decided not to seek re-election. He would regret that decision. He was barely 50, young, energetic, and much of his reform program had yet to win congressional approval. Teddy Roosevelt, however, thought that he had the perfect successor in William Howard Taft, who had been his Secretary of War and with whom he had worked closely. Taft had supported TR's reforms and offered him very shrewd advice on many occasions. TR thought Taft possessed the skills and ideas to complete the reform agenda. To reach that conclusion, however, Teddy Roosevelt had to ignore some obvious differences between the two men. Taft neither liked nor was good at politics. With the exception of the judgeship in Ohio, he had never held elective office. He was a brilliant constitutional jurist, however. Everyone thought so. His respect for the Constitution made him suspicious of the powers that TR had arrogated to the presidency. He was by nature a cautious and conservative man, and this endeared him to many of the Republican old guard. As TR's anointed successor, Taft easily defeated William Jennings Bryan in 1908. Poor William Jennings Bryan, I think it was his third time, with 52% of the vote. His conservatism, however, quickly became apparent in his appointment of corporation lawyers rather than reformers to most cabinet positions. Taft's troubles began when he appeared to side with the old guard against progressives in two highly acrimonious congressional battles, the first over tariff legislation and the second over the powers of House Speaker Uncle Joe Cannon. Progressives had long desired a tariff reduction because they thought it would benefit consumers and benefit farmers and check the power of the corporations. Taft himself raised expectations for tariff reduction when he called a special session of Congress to consider both tariff reduction and inheritance tax, both of which are progressive things. The bill was passed by the House but gutted in the Senate when the old guard killed the tax and most of the tariff reduction. Progressives pleaded with Taft to pressure conservative senators into line. He did pressure the old guard into including a 2% corporate income tax into the bill, but he did not insist on tariff reductions. The resulting Payne-Aldrich tariff was signed August 5th, 1909, and did nothing to encourage imports. I just realized I put 1907 on the slide. That's wrong. 1909 did nothing to encourage imports. The tariff reductions were too small. Progressive Republicans were bitterly disappointed and held Taft responsible. That income tax, by the way, will be struck down by the Supreme Court. More importantly, however, the more important battle that angered the Republican progressives is when Taft withdrew his support from their efforts to strip Cannon of his legislative powers, which they believed he was putting to improper use. Some people said to Taft, look, man, you don't want to go against Joseph Cannon. He's too powerful, and if you fail in this attempt to strip him of power, you're going to be in trouble. And Taft, fearful, diffident, agreed with that. So by 1910, the Republican insurgents no longer looked to Taft for leadership and instead entered into an alliance with reform-minded congressional Democrats. This coalition worked and successfully curbed Cannon's powers, and over Taft's objections diluted the pro-business nature of a railroad regulation bill. But it was a bruising battle over Taft's conservation policies that completely destroyed his relations between himself and progressive Republicans. This so-called Ballinger-Pinchot controversy is what really put the nail in Taft's political coffin. Secretary of the Interior was a guy named Richard Ballinger, and he had aroused progressive suspicions by reopening for private commercial use 1 million acres of land that the Roosevelt administration had previously brought under federal protection. Now, heading the National Forest Service and therefore reporting to Richard Ballinger was still TR's old friend, Gifford Pinchot. And he obtained information implicating Ballinger in the sale of Alaskan coal deposits to a syndicate headed by J.P. Morgan and mining magnate David Guggenheim. Guggenheim also has a magnificent museum in New York you should visit. So apparently Pinchot's saying, look, Ballinger is taking kickbacks to give these preferential contracts to these oligarchs. And he takes this info to Taft. And Taft defends Ballinger. And not knowing what else to do, Pinchot leaked the story to the press and called for a congressional investigation. Now, that cost Pinchot his job. Taft fired him. But the nation was once again riveted on corporate greed and government corruption. Taft's old guard allies controlled the investigation, and Ballinger was exonerated. But Louis Brandeis, who was the lawyer for the congressional reformers, kept the controversy alive by accusing Taft and his attorney general of tampering with evidence sent to congressional committee. Whatever hope Taft had of escaping political damage from this affair evaporated when Teddy Roosevelt returns from a long hunting trip in Africa by way of England, where he made a highly publicized visit with his old buddy Pinchot. Arriving in the U.S. in the summer of 1910, TR quickly returned to politics. He embarked on a speaking tour, the high point of which was explaining the new nationalism in a small town in Kansas. This was a far-reaching reform program that called for a strong federal government to stabilize the economy, protect the weak, and restore social harmony. Recall, TR did not want to destroy big business. He simply wanted government to get big enough to offset it to protect little people. The 1910 congressional elections confirmed the popularity of TR's positions. Insurgent Republicans repeatedly beat conservative Republicans in primaries, and the Democrats' embrace of reform gave them a majority in the House for the first time since 1894. Robert La Follette was challenging Taft for the presidential nomination, but he seemed to suffer a nervous breakdown in February of 1912, and when that happened, TR announced his own candidacy. La Follette later recovered and resumed his campaign, but he could not hope to beat Teddy Roosevelt. Taft couldn't either if the decision was in the hands of rank-and-file Republicans. In the 13 states that held primaries, recall that not every state, this is just now when this is taking off, so not every state does it, but in the 13 that did, TR won nearly 75% of the delegates. But the party's leadership remained with the old guard, and they were determined to deny TR the nomination. Taft was angered by TR's challenge and refused to step aside, and he won the nomination, the Republican nomination for president. Now, TR had expected Taft to win the nomination, so the night before the convention opened, he made a fiery speech to 5,000 supporters and vowed that the party leadership would not derail their reform efforts. So the next day, he and his supporters withdrew from the convention, and in August held their own convention for the new Progressive Party, which nominated Teddy Roosevelt. It also had a sweeping reform platform, sweeping regulation of corporations, extensive worker protections, things like a minimum wage, workmen's compensation, prohibition of child labor, a sharply graduated income tax, and female suffrage. This new party was a remarkable assemblage of reformers, social workers, suffragists, conservationists, and others. He told him, "I'm as strong as a bull moose," hence the unofficial bull moose name for the party. What was the effect of this? Well, the effect was the Republican vote was clearly split. And the Progressive Party could not even guarantee the votes of all the progressives. So what happened, as you see here, is Teddy Roosevelt got 27% of the vote. Taft got 23. That's pretty embarrassing. Taft was a major party nominee, and Teddy Roosevelt, a third-party candidate, got more votes. Note that Debs, running as a socialist, got 6% of the vote. This is the height of power of socialists in America. 5 years later, an event will happen, a global event that will make Americans even less amenable to socialism. And so the winner, with 42% of the vote, was the Democratic nominee, a guy named Woodrow Wilson.